Hey guys, today I will read about George Washington. The jokes on George. President George Washington had a reputation for being particularly polite. He doffed his hat to common servants and to fine gentlemen alike. Though such behavior was one of the many reasons that my family greatly admired Mr. Washington, there came a time when the president's politeness became a laughing matter. One day, his old friend Mr. Charles Wilson Peel invited George to visit a new display at Charles' world famous Natural History Museum. Of course, George said yes, but it was out of more than politeness and friendship that he accepted the invitation. I am sure that he was also a bit curious. Like most of us in Philadelphia, the president knew that Mr. Peel didn't do things in a normal run of the mill way. Never had, never would. For instance, when his first pocket watch stopped working, did he take it to someone to be repaired? Certainly not. Charles just pulled his watch apart, studied how it worked, and fixed it himself. And when he saw portraits painted by Mr. Fraser from Norfolk, which he thought were terrible, Charles was convinced he could do a better job. Did it matter that he had never painted? Of course not. By the time Charles joined the American Revolution a few years later, he had become one of America's best portrait painters. In fact, he painted more portraits of George Washington than any other artists. Charles was an inventor too. Like his friend Benjamin Franklin, he designed bridges, experimented with new ways to heat houses, and built several devices that made life easier for folks, such as an apple parer and a corn husker. But some of his inventions were simply for fun, like the amazing moving picture theater. By shining lights from behind a transparent screen, moving objects on stage like puppets perform exciting performances. One of the most famous naval battle using flashlights for the performance, wooden waves that heaved up and down while water sprayed the audience from hidden pipes. But it was Charles Wilson Peel's Philadelphia Museum that we all thought was the most amazing. Visitors never knew what strange and wonderful things to expect. Its yard was a zoo filled with monkeys, eagles, bears, and snakes. Some animals were in cages, but others, like a great elk and a strange five-legged, two-tailed cow, wandered about freely. Inside the museum was one of a kind just like its curator. Not only were Charles' famous portraits hung there, but there were displays filled with stuffed animals, many peering at visitors from behind trees, rocks, and grass. Never before had museum animals been displayed this way. And there were glass cases of dried insects, and minerals and rocks, and even the gigantic bones of a mysterious beast that Mr. Pugh and other naturalists called a mammoth. I believe President Washington couldn't help but smile as he thought about Charles Wilson Peel. After all, the man didn't even give his children biblical names the way other God-fearing American colonists had. Most of his 70 children were named after famous artists. Names he found in a dictionary about painters: Raphael, Angelica Kaufman, Rembrandt, Titian Ramsay, Rubens, Sophit Nisba, Akos Loga. Most people figured that Charles had chosen those names because he was so serious about his painting, and George knew that was true. George knew that was true, but he also knew that Mr. Peel had a sense of humor. So President George Washington was excited about seeing Mr. Peel's new display. He was about to retire and would soon return home to Mount Vernon, so it might be his last chance to visit Peel's museum. Besides, going would be a nice break from the difficult job of being president. The new display was inspired by the Indian chiefs who often visited Philadelphia while it was America's capital. Mr. Peel had carefully fashioned wax figures of Chief Blue Jacket and his friend Red Pole of Shawnee tribe. Then he edited figures of people from several other world cultures. The rumor was that the figures looked real in authentic clothing and looked like it's really speed. So the president donned his hat and expected them. But little did George knew that he was about to be fooled, hoodwinked, tricked, right there in his friend's museum. When George arrived, he and Charles ambled through the museum, catching up on old times, because there was always plenty to see. George was glancing this way and that as they strode toward the wax figures. But then they drew near a door that led to a winding staircase. George slowly slowed as he saw two familiar faces. Titian and Raphael Peale were just starting up the steps. Polite as always, President Washington smiled and bowed to the young man. Then the slight smile on the president's face faded. Titian and Raphael hadn't bothered to return a greeting from the President of the United States, or worse, from their father's friend. In fact, they continued to ignore him completely. Suddenly, Mr. Pugh started to laugh. George Washington, the most respected man in America, was shocked that Charles seemed to think his son's impudence amusing. The president was flummoxed, confused, dismayed, until he, until he, realized Titian and Raphael hadn't moved a hair when he spotted them. Then George laughed too. What George was looking at was the most incredible painting Mr. Pugh would ever do. Its frame was a real door jamb, and a wooden step extended the painted staircase out into the room. It was an illusion, and colossal joke. Do not feel embarrassed, Charles said to George, for not long ago a sharp-eyed dog tried to climb the staircase. George Washington was expected live-looking wax Indians, but he found live-looking oil-painted peels, and his reputation for politeness was confirmed. Not many men would bow courteously to a painting. I know this story is true, not because I heard from a trustworthy source, but because I was there. I am Rembrandt Peale, and the Philadelphia Museum was my home. By the way, I saw more than one dog try to run up those stairs. So that's all of it for today's book. Bye, everyone. Bye.